first of all, everyone, welcome to this webinar that we've put together, which is a brand new way of talking about tennis from me and my two friends, Voye and Frank. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a second, but just a little bit about me before we move on to the topic. My name is Simon Wheatley. I'm formerly the Performance Coach Education Manager for the LTA. I worked for 14 years in the Federation, working across British tennis at developing and delivering the highest performance qualifications for coaches in Great Britain. I've also been an author of 2 books, and I've presented at international conferences and different federations around the world. And I guess my passion is, I have a real passion for learning, and I have a real passion for helping coaches flourish in the sport. And so I guess my whole philosophy in coaching is around winning through others, that really helping others to be great coaches is something I've had a passion from since a young age. So I'm really excited to be sharing these conversations with you over the next kind of several weeks around key topics that are really close to my heart and my thinking, that need to be talked about and discussed to help you make sense of what's going on in the world in tennis, but then bring clarity to what you do, amplify the best parts of coaching, but also to challenge some of the things that are out there that are going on, that how we can move forwards in the world of coaching. So that's a little bit about me and why I'm so excited about doing this, these podcasts and video webinars over the upcoming weeks. I'm now going to pass on to Voye just to talk a little bit about his background and why he wanted to get involved in these videos.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Yeah, just a few words about myself. My name is Horace Maish. I'm coming from Croatia, and I started to coach pretty young during my university times and studying, and was coaching for over 15 years. I was also a national coach for the juniors in Croatia. And after that, I was working for 18 years for ITF as an ITF Tennis Europe Development Officer, being in charge of assisting tennis nations to develop tennis in their countries, especially in coach education and junior development. Since 2018, I am also working as an independent consultant and actually working with several national associations together in some coach education programs and with some player development programs. So yeah, same like Simon, I also like to share my knowledge to develop the people, and I believe that everybody can and should fulfill his potentials. So with these words, I would also like to pass it to Frank.
Well, my name is Frank van Vrijenhoven from the Netherlands. I've been a tennis coach since young age. I started coaching before I even got any formal education as a coach. So more or less the way the old-fashioned coaches would start their career. I've been a coach in the club. Then I started working for the Federation, worked for 36 years for the Federation, both with coaches education and player development, taking teams to international events, etc. Then the last 2 years, I've been the technical director in Indonesia and working with the Davis Cup team, Fed Cup team, all the junior selection teams. And I've been in about 75 countries all over the world. So I had the opportunity to look at different systems, different traditions, different cultures with tennis. And that helped me a lot to do a better job as a player developer and also as a coach developer. My biggest interest is also to see other people grow and to make sure that people have the possibility to develop themselves a bit further. So that is what I've been doing all my life, actually, and I still enjoy that. So it's nice in this video to talk with my two colleagues and friends and to exchange ideas. And hopefully the people who are watching this will also pick some points that they can use in their own practical work.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Avoye. I mean, I think we teed it up brilliantly there, because that's what the purpose of these videos, as the title says. You know, we're going to talk today about, you know, coach education. This is the area that the three of us have probably had the most experience in. I worked out the amount of years that we've been working in coach education combined is circa 100. So I think we've all had very different experiences working all over the world. And I think to share some of those experiences with people that are interested in listening is really our main goal here. And it's not necessarily that we're going to agree on every point. In fact, we want to embrace healthy debate, different points of view, different ways of looking at the world. And we're going to bring some quite interesting conversations to the table on that. So if I may, I'm going to just start speaking freely. There's no script, no PowerPoints. This is all just a conversation amongst colleagues. But hopefully we'll help you as coaches reflect upon some of the things we're talking about. I want to talk a little bit about the historical arc of coaching education and how we've got to where we are right now. I mean, the year is 2021. And coach education has been delivered in many countries to different levels of degree and intensity, either through the federation themselves, writing and education pathways, which are normally traditionally in levels, level A, B, or C, or levels 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but not just federations, of course. The ITF, and I know, Voya, you'll speak a bit more about this in a second. They've also been looking after the development of more of the developing nations around the world on their educational pathways through an ITF certification program. But let's go back even further for a second and look at the historical profession of coaching and why coach education was needed, because I think it then provides context to where we are now, and then perhaps gives us an opportunity to project into the future how education and development of coaches will look moving forwards. And it's in my opinion, and it's just my opinion on this, and please, Voya and Frank, jump in if you see it differently. But when we look back at the coach, it was pretty much done by parents. If you listen to Judy Murray talk about Andy, she didn't have a formal qualification either, Frank. And when she first started coaching, it was more that she just taught the game to the people that wanted to be taught the game to in her local town. And I think that kind of what I call corner shop coaching, the guy that runs the corner shop, or the local postman, or the tennis fan at the club would teach young people to play the game. And that was the first iteration of essentially the idea of this profession, that we teach others to play the game, and therefore you are some kind of a coach. And then what happened over time is, of course, it became more professionalized, and physical education teachers in schools. And I think about the 60s and 70s and 80s, the 1960s and 70s and 80s, where we started to qualify more teachers in physical education, and when tennis was often a popular sport to teach children at both primary and secondary modern school age. And therefore we started to develop a bit more idea of, well, we teach tennis to large groups. And then, of course, what happened is, as federations started to become more and more developed, grow their personnel, they started to develop coach education departments, because they recognized that coach is king or queen, and they have a real opportunity to grow retention in the sport, to accelerate talent to fulfill their potential, as you said, Avoye. And therefore, there was this transition from, well, maybe we need to turn it from an amateurish, volunteer-based service from people at the tennis clubs that would offer support to young people or adults, to actually a profession, to a certified profession that recognized that coaching is a job, either part-time or full-time, but there are skills that you need to develop in order to do that job well. And therefore we need to put in official training in order to help develop coaches to be deployed into clubs, to schools, to academies, to develop players. And of course, there's still a more organic route into coaching, which is being a player and then not knowing what to do if you stop playing tennis, or if you stop your university, and then you fall into coaching perhaps. But when I look back on the historical kind of trajectory, and this is a real low resolution, grand narrative way of looking at it, because I know it could be different in different countries, but I really believe that that's probably captured, as I said, in a very simple way, the historical transition of moving from volunteer-based service to teaching in schools, which you'd have to have some training in, to actually then federations setting up systems to train people through official certifications. And then what came on the back of that, of course, was, well, once we've qualified these people, what do we do with them? And what we need to do with them is to keep them updated, keep them upskilled. And therefore, what happened is federations recognized that we need to develop coaches continuously through accreditation programs. So at the Lawn Tennis Association, we had a license points program, which was, I think, implemented by Ann Pankhurst back in the 90s, which basically said that you have to get so many points per year to maintain your license with the federation. And that was a way of trying to motivate people to stay current, stay engaged with the federation's initiatives, to keep developing them on the job in their field, so we keep improving the level of coaching year on year. So that's a little bit how I see it. I just wanted to throw it over to the two of you to say, would you add anything to that, or perhaps dispute something and say, well, I see it slightly differently?
Yeah, I would like to go a bit further back in time, not because I'm the oldest and because I all experienced it from firsthand, but our Tennis Coaches Association started in 1928. And the way they would be educated as a coach was very funny. Tennis lessons were always one-on-one, no group lessons.
Right.
And they would have ball boys collecting the balls. And when a ball boy was ill and not present, they would skip the lesson, because how can you give tennis lessons without a ball boy? Wow. And it's very funny now to think about that, but it is an essential step, because those ball boys would be there for, let's say, starting at the age of 12 or 13 or something. They would stay with the coach for several years, listening to what the specialist would say, how he would correct things, etc. And of course, by playing a lot and becoming more skilled, they would have a lot of experience by just seeing, like monkey see, monkey do.
Right.
And then they would start their own tennis, let's say, company by offering lessons. And they started to structure that. In the Netherlands, I know that the first part or commission in the or committee in the federation started in about 64 or 68.
Wow.
And they started to make the courses, well, have a curriculum for it and have the contents there. So that is like how it started. And it's interesting because every time it's about theory and practice, and we should never forget it is about doing. And actually the theoretical part should be knowing what you're doing and improve your effectiveness. That's what I certainly think is very important. So coming from there and seeing how it further developed, you have a situation now where you see that sometimes the balance is not there, too much theory, not enough practice. And also with online coaching, or let's say distant learning, a lot of this practical experience, like being mentored by a specialist, is taken out of the curriculum. That takes a lot of time, is expensive, is hard to get organized, etc. And so that is like a further view back into time about the development of it in the Netherlands. I don't know about other countries.
Okay, perhaps then I can jump in and give you just a little bit of overview about the broader picture of coach education, that I would call it, especially more in focus on Europe, that we are all three coming from. And here I would like to say, first of all, that it's very important to be aware that especially in the former times when there was a East and West Europe, communist and, let's say, democratic countries divided, that in the Eastern Europe, you should actually accomplish a university degree in order to be able to coach. And in some of the Western countries, and still nowadays, you don't need any formal education to give coaching to the kids, or coaching tennis in particular. And here also there is one more thing, and you both have been spoken about national associations, coaches associations that were in charge. And it is typically for the Western European countries that national associations are in charge of coach education programs, versus, let's say, in the Eastern European countries, where actually it was driven, better to say, by support universities. Obviously, more science was involved there. But I have to say that also nowadays in Eastern Europe, it came back, or it came closer, better to say, to the Western European models, where the national associations are taking over the responsibilities for running the coach education programs. from the world perspective, I would say this very similar system is in the Canada and Australia, but in US, we are all aware that actually there, the coach education programs have been mainly driven by the private organization like PTR, for example. Even though recently, and you are in contact with them, Simon, also USDA is getting involved. They will try also to structure it differently. And there are also some private organizations like PTCA that try to also create like an international licenses that we'll be also talking a bit more later on. Very important driver of coach education around the world is also ITF, International Tennis Federation, that is trying to help the nations without own system and actually provide the courses or provide assistance in developing their national education structure. So I hope that with this few information, also our audience can get a better understanding of the complexity of this coach education landscape, I would call it, around the world.
So wow, there's loads of things to unpick there, I think, which interest me. And I think one of the things to unpick is this whole idea of the intensity of coach education per se, because there will be a lot of people listening that will say formal coach education it doesn't mean anything. It's it's learning on the job is the only way to become a good coach. So a lot of people that are critics of coach education, I mean traditional pathways of qualifications, they're not particularly complimentary about them, and mainly because they feel that it's a vocational job, it's a doing job, as Frank said, and therefore why should I sit in a classroom, or why should I go through a formal course, modules and assignments and be assessed, when actually I'm going to learn best from being on the job. So should we unpack that a little bit, because there is a divide there in society around what people perceive that the role of coach education is in terms of official certifications. Does one of you want to jump on that?
Sure. I think there are several elements there. Of course, you have to understand where our references come from in life. Let's say as a young parent, when you have children, your base of reference is what your parents did to you. And even without really realizing, you would do a lot of things similar to what your parents did, except for some things that you really didn't like. You will skip that and find another solution. But further on, it is your firm basis to start with, like, this is how I do it. In tennis, it's similar. The way you were developed as a player by a coach, even if it's like recreational in a club, those are your first moments of learning in tennis, and that will be a lifelong reference for you. For a lot of people, without realizing, it is what you go back to, because that feels comfortable. That's like, yeah, that was how it was, and I can use that. So to have an alternative for that and go to other methods of teaching, that is actually what we have to implement, to make sure that you make choices. It's not how to tell them how you have to do it, but it's interesting to know what other and probably more effective possibilities there are, so that you can learn from that.
So Frank, am I understanding you right, that you're saying that it's as much about unlearning things as it is about learning things, and adding to your toolkit of your repertoire of possibilities as a coach? That's one of the major jobs of coach educators, right?
Yeah, except for the word unlearning. I mean, you cannot unlearn something because the connections are there, but you can replace them by better ones. So the example that you may recognize is, I always talk about coaches who have the latest iPhone in their pocket with all the possibilities there are. But in their coaching, they still work like they have this old black telephone where you have to dial the number. You have to turn this disc to get the connection. And if you would never be informed about other possibilities, still using that old phone, and you don't know about an iPhone, it means that you will always stay like in like a century ago. So in coaching, realizing that you got your basic instruction information in the 60s or 70s of the previous century, then there is, of course, much more now that we can use and make it more effective. And that's part of the instruction. For me, the theory should always have a practical value. And by teaching them things that they can use to be more effective in coaching, that is the most important thing that we can do as a coach educator.
Look,
That's a great
Simon,
point.
we have been always confronted with this question of purpose of the formal education, but I would always ask the people that are questioning formal education is, would you bring your daughter to the dentist that was just actually working with another dentist without having a formal, let's say, university and finish his formal education? I would say that none of the parents would agree to bring a kid to somebody who doesn't have I would say, a formal degree that he's a dentist.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's a perception of a coaching job. What is a coaching job? If coaching job is just teaching forehand and backhand stroke, perhaps you don't really need any formal education. But if you consider that as a coach, you are influencing personality of young people. It's more almost like working as psychologists, as we all know. And if we are considering that in sport, we can develop a lot of life skills. That is also more and more important topic in coaching, I would say also in LTA and KNLTB and around the world. Then having competencies to develop these skills, I think, required a bit more knowledge than just incidental learning or having own experience. But because of that, so I would like to ask you a question now, actually, and that's also a question that I'm asking myself. How our coach education programs are really changing the coaching habits in practical, in a club environment or in a tennis academy? So what are actually your experiences with that?
So if I may, I'll just jump in on that, because you've just said something very interesting to me. One of the things that I think has changed, I talked about the arc of coaching, how it's changed over time to become much more professional, a credible industry, a job, a career. Lots of people have jobs, very few people have careers. And now tennis coaching can be a career if you keep accelerating and developing and pursuing opportunities. What you've talked about there about is how has the practical coaching of coaches made a difference? How's it made an impact in the sport? So just to give one little practical example that I think changed, and this was heavily influenced by Louis Kaya when he was, well, he's still at the LTA, but we worked a lot together. And, he was someone that came in and really changed the culture around coaching in British tennis. And one of the things that he did, and it sounds so simple, but it's not simple, it's not trivial, it's important, is that he moved the dial from thinking that the role of the coach was to improve the technical and tactical skills of the players. So we would call those player skills. He then put another layer on and said, right, the role of the coach is also to improve the performer skills, the head, the heart, the legs, the psychological, the emotional, the physical skills of the player. It's not just the role of the S&C trainer to develop the physical athletic abilities of the player, because you spend more time with that individual. You warm them up, you cool them down, you prepare them at tournaments. And then a layer beyond that emerged from that, which was to say, well, not only should we develop the performer qualities of people, we have a role, as you just said then, Hrvoje, to develop the personal skills of someone, the personality, to manage their temperament, to understand, to take an interest in them beyond the court, which is that whole idea that in the future, the role of the coach is to be more than just a tennis expert. It's to be an expert of sport, to be an expert of the community you're in. It's to be an expert of helping young people grow with well-being in mind, their well-being, their mental well-being, their physical well-being, taking an interest in their life in general, not just in their tennis pursuits. So I think that has changed a lot in British tennis, mainly in British tennis, because that's where I've worked mainly in my educational role. And so that's just a short example of, so now we say in British tennis that the role of the coach is to help develop the person, the performer, and the player. And that's changed a lot over years. It used to just be the player. The role of the coach was to make them play the game better or to make them hit the ball better, which I quite like as a narrative. It's like, you come to a lesson with me Do you want a lesson on hitting the ball better or playing the game better? And then you put singles and doubles in there. It adds another layer of dimension. But essentially, what I see is an evolution of the role of the governing body to develop coaches beyond just knowledge of the game. Is there anything you want to add to that, or you see it differently, perhaps? Or
sure. there's no, it's not to disagree, because I totally agree about that. But to make it a bit more simple, when we started talking about competencies, that's actually where these principles all came in. The things that you just mentioned, which Louis brought in. And that's about the how you talk about competencies. It's mostly used as a, let's say, a theoretical word and something that is not very practical. But I think it's important for the structure of coaches education to use that principle of competency, because the competency is actually a combination of the knowledge and understanding. That's one. Then you have the skills. That's two. Then you have the personal characteristics and the attitude. That's number three. And number four is your passion and your motivation. So sometimes those last two are combined, but actually in the definition that we used here in the Netherlands, we have those two split up. So in total, it's 4 elements, which is the same as what you just put forward. And it is so essential that you talk about the development of a person who is going to be a tennis coach and will help other people. And it means that you have to deal with all these elements. And that's why I say you cannot do that only with distance learning, because you have to be there. You need a kind of mentor, someone who helps you to also reflect on things that you do. And when you see these old principles from, let's say, the 70s or 80s, you see them being used by your candidate. And then you can say, okay, you try this, that's okay. Let's try another way. Look at this one. And you give an example or let him try it. And then it appears to be more effective. That's how you can really accelerate the learning process. And I think that is an important thing to realize.
yeah.
Part of this, what you just said about actually using the knowledge and the habits that you have been taught with. I believe also for the coaches, it's very often a challenge to adopt new ideas or to put them in practical work with players, because they're afraid of actually perhaps looking stupid because they are looking differently than environment. Yep. Or if they then fail, that will also not feel personally, I would say, good enough or competent. And then here the word competence is coming again in the picture. So I believe that it's very important that we support the coaches. Like I know that in LTA now you have been adding like a mentoring schemes to your coach education programs. And I strongly believe that's the way to support the coaches in order to take the ownership of the knowledge. Because very often in our courses, they are listening to the new information, new ideas, but they didn't really get the ownership. And perhaps do you already have some experience with these mentoring schemes, and does it really help coaches to actually develop this ownership of the, let's call it, new ideas and concepts?
Yeah, I mean, the mentoring scheme at the Lawn Tennis Association is a relatively new scheme. And, you know, it was one that I, with Simon Jones at the LTA, we wanted to create it in the performance space, because we recognize that actually having a trusted advisor, there's a real value in that. Someone that you can talk with around tennis, you can talk with around your career, talk with around your challenges, your barriers, obstacles, you know, all these things. They're important to talk out with people to help individuals flourish, because people get blocks, they get stuck, they get stale. So I'm a strong believer, and I've had a mentor myself my whole life, and it's been a hugely invaluable experience for me. I've been able to be pushed, pulled in the right directions. To be held the mirror up to my face to say, look, Simon, there's maybe a different way of looking at the world on this. There's something else you can do. You can do more of that, less of that. And I find that incredibly valuable myself, personally. And I think it's like diving into a bucket of cold ice water at the start. It can be deeply uncomfortable when people are probing you with multiple questions. And and watching you coach, and perhaps you're thinking they're judging you in some way. And that's a difficult experience for, especially for young people that maybe are not as comfortable at being watched and probed and challenged in certain ways. And I think that's maybe a challenge of young people per se these days, is that we have to be very careful on not to offend anyone, not to upset their feelings, say the wrong thing. But at the same time, people need to be challenged and have these healthy debates in order to move their ideas forward. So for me, yeah, it's been a hugely impactful experience to myself, but I know that in British Tennis, through the pilot project, there was a lot of good results, data-driven results, feedback from the candidates and the mentors that this really helped people to move forwards, to see other realms of possibilities in their life beyond just the, what people can see blinkered with their eyes, what's right in front of them. So you can really open people's minds up to thinking differently, feeling differently, acting differently, working differently. So I'm a big believer that it will make a massive impact, because what I like about it is it's one-on-one. It's about you. Whereas that's the challenge in coach education, isn't it? I mean, maybe we can talk about that when you go to a course, a level 1, level 2, level 3, you are part of a cohort of people. And there are some huge advantages to that, because peer-to-peer learning and getting exposed and having time to think and feel and digest the information. But the danger is that you're essentially, a template of information is put onto you through that learning program, versus maybe what the learning needs are of me versus that person versus that person versus that person. So that's another question to maybe talk around. Does anyone want to talk about that?
Actually, Simon, you have opened just now another topic. Actually, it's about where we go with in the future with coach education, as perhaps mentoring seems one of the elements. This online learning as a second element that for sure became very popular because of Corona in last year. So we all moved from more contact, let's say, programs to actually more online learning. And we have been all actually doing this and experienced the different challenges. But I believe that will be for sure part of the future, because the life is changing. And we all know that for the coaches, it's always difficult to, let's say, stay for, let's say, 2 weeks in one place, and perhaps having like in the kind of LTB, I know that I had 1 day per week joining the programs. It's possible in the smaller countries, but when you have to travel too much, then of course it's again some other formats to be looked for. But apart from mentoring scheme, online learning, I believe also that it's very important to look for the new ways to passing the information and to try to understand the new generation that will be much more online, using social media, more dynamic, and perhaps also more individually tailored than it was before, when we want to conform all the people to the same way of teaching. What are your thoughts about this, to have it more openings and actually more, how to say, diversity even at the end of the coach education?
Yeah, I have something to add to it. So my answer is more linked to what Simon said. This mentoring scheme, I've seen fantastic results with people really being happy on both sides doing it, and see the student learn and accelerate the learning. However, there's one prerequisite. The coach, who is the mentor, he is he's the person, the prerequisite should be that he has a kind of coach educator character. And I've seen that a lot of situations, it's not like an apprentice who gets a lot of knowledge and experience from his mentor, but very often it's just like free hands, because I'm the person who is in charge of the tennis academy, so you are here to learn, and I just give you a basket of balls and send you away with someone. I don't have time to talk to you, but just go, because you have to do it, and then you will be better. After your session or 5 sessions where I get the money, you get a little bit. So it's profitable for me. And when you have questions, that I don't have time for that. So very often we saw like a kind of business preference there instead of a teaching and learning situation. So there is a prerequisite to make this mentoring effective. So that's just what I want to add. It's not automatically an effective system to just put someone there like a obligation to have these 100 or 200 or 1,000 hours with an experienced coach, because that makes you better. It really is important that you have a kind of structured situation with enough time to ask questions, the probing questions Simon was referring to, and that's where you have to take some time for it.
Okay, Frank, I would like to reflect a little bit on this mentoring, I say, issues that you mentioned just a second ago. And personally, I have to say that I would thank most of my progress as a coach to having a mentors. And from very beginning, I would say that I had top mentors in the environment where I was growing up in Croatia, former Davis Cup, Fed Cup coaches that were working with top players, but also running their own tennis schools. So also being interested in participation tennis. And what I can say that actually they didn't taught me. It was about me asking the questions. And also here, what was important for me was that I found people that also trusted in myself. And that I think very important, that you have a mentor that you feel that he trusts in yourself. And then to feel free to ask any question, so that there are no stupid questions. And as I grew up as a coach and I asked different questions, I learned different things from them. So obviously it's very important that coach seek for the answers and coming to the mentor with his own ideas, not being afraid, discussing that, and then learning from them, from their experience and suggestions. So for sure, that's something what I would like to see much more in the future in the coach education systems around the world. And I'm sure that more coaches would benefit because they can individually develop themselves.
I think it's an interesting point, because I understand what you're saying, Frank, that what mentoring cannot be is cloning. It cannot be cloning. It cannot be, I am the leader with experience and I've developed all these players and I am, the messiah of coaching. And therefore, if you want to be good, you've got to be like me, which I believe it's a perverse way of looking at the world. But I don't think many people do that. But some do, and some will, and some really believe that in order for the person to be better, they should be shifted towards my way of seeing the world. But I'm hoping we're moving away from that narrative a little bit more now to actually, someone once said to me, mentoring is about asking the right questions and listening to the right answers. And I thought that was a really neat way of summing up the whole purpose of mentoring. I think what we've slightly tipped into here is the idea of apprenticeship, vocational training, on the job, watching someone else or them watching you, and then understanding who's trying to pull and push people in which direction and how they go about doing that. And if it's based on the narrative that I'm going to clone you to be more like me, then I think that's a really dangerous, sour route to go down, versus how can I help you amplify your best qualities, minimize the qualities that are blocking you from being what you could be. I think then that's a much more healthy directive doctrine that will actually help the coach. So that's just my little bit on that. But and I know we're jumping around because so many ideas are coming to our ideas as we're talking about these topics, but I think we should explore further, Frank. I'm going to ask you to talk about this whole idea of the theoretical versus practical coach education. And I mean, you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah. When I explained a few minutes ago about the competencies and the 4 different areas there, let me use the easy verbs to explain that. It's to think, it's to do, to be, and to want. And when you think of the word to think, it's not the same as just getting a lot of knowledge and understanding. So I strongly think that we need to have important thinking skills to understand what we are doing and to look for alternative ways to be more effective, which is different than just putting a lot of stuff in your brain and expect you to memorize that, take exams. And when I think back of when I became a tennis coach, we had to learn a lot of names of muscles in the body. and of course something about blood circulation and etc. And I started to criticize that more and more, because in my long career working with top players and with beginners, starting players, I never had to understand or use the words that I learned in Latin for the muscles. So we have those things like, okay, quadriceps is quite well known, but when you talk about the tibialis anterior, which is like in the lower leg, why? And always the defense comes from people from universities who had to learn that themselves, and that's why you also have to learn it. Because I had to do it, you also have to do it. And that's not practical learning. So I think it's much more important to think about the things you're doing. That's why I like the words to think and then to do more than just your skills and the knowledge and understanding. It is about knowledge and understanding that help you to be better in your doing. Yes. And also that can help you to understand why you are like this, because that's about your personality, and learn a little bit about your wanting to do it, to have your motivation to do the job, where you fit in, and how to reflect on yourself. That's a totally different theoretical perspective than we used to do, well, let's say a few decades ago. And it still is there. You see a lot, like in universities, people get so much stuff in their head which they're never going to use as a practical coach. It's different if you want to be a physiotherapist or something, but I actually never had any advantage of having this large theoretical background which they gave me in my education to become a coach.
And I think that's probably, that's why the critics of coach education, in a formal sense of qualifications, modules, assessments, assignments, learning, the critics would they have a point. There's you have to give the devil their due, and it's like, well, we don't like it when they criticize coach education and they think they should just get their qualification because they were a good player or they've produced good players themselves, or but there's a fly in the ointment with that, and it is a sense that they have a point of view, and their point of view is that a lot of the time, many coach educators, many courses do fall into the trap of trying to give unnecessary information and asking people to learn it in which they won't use again. And I think that's a good summary you've said there, Frank, that the best type of coach education is practical. But I think it's more than that. It's not just practical. As you said, it's theoretical in the sense that it helps people to codify what's happening through a methodology, through a process, through a framework, through principles. It's not a prescriptive, perhaps, dot to dot menu of what you should do. It's not a step-by-step guide, but what it does give you is a way of thinking about what you're already doing. So I think that's a really important point, that it's like you already do this stuff, but this is why you're doing it, and this is the effect it can have. And by then knowing that, you are then informed to do it more or less depending on the context that you're in. And that's not, again, a trivial point. It's a really important coach education message, that by understanding to a deeper level what you're doing, you may be able to refine it even greater and choose when to use it in the right moment with the right player to really amplify the learning possibility. Because it's all about learning, isn't it? The whole idea of coach education is that we help people to learn, to help others learn. It's like the reason why you're going on a course is actually not for you, in a way. It's for your players. Because by you becoming better, you have more chance, I believe, that your players could become better, because you'll be more skilled at in player development as a coach. So that's quite a nice pivot. Hrvoje?
I would like to emphasize what you just said, and you, in my opinion, mentioned one very important word, and that's to understand why. Instead, not to learn so much about what in terms of information, but to understand why. And if you do that, you understand the process. Yeah. And actually developing players or persons is a process, and it's pretty individual. So if you understand the process and the principles of this, then actually you will be able to do it practically well. So I believe in a coach education program, that's something what should be very much emphasized, that to make people understand why, so that they can then individualize their programs instead of copy paste, like we all know these forms in technique, like an example, or knowing the muscles, like Frank actually mentioned before. And Frank, may I quote you? I hear that a long time ago. Everything is good to know, but the question is what is essential, what is really important for the coaches to know.
Yeah.
And very often for us, when we prepare the presentation, I believe both for you as for me, is not what to say, but what not to say. To avoid confusing people with too many information and keep the essential information that will help them to do their job better. So here, these are the words that I would like to add to what you just said.
Yeah, we often made the joke, like, if you can't convince them, confuse them. And that is...
So we are confusing today the people at the end of the day. That was our main message for them, to be confused at the end, and no less.
It's coming from Confucius, as you know.
Well, so on that, if I may, just the last few minutes, maybe each of us can talk around. Okay, so based on historical understanding of coach educations, both the advantages of it and the critics of it, and then understanding the present climate that we're in, this idea of the internet and blended learning and more instant learning through social media. One of the things I just want to share, and it links to your point then, Avoye, about I have a real concern that the danger with seeing short, sharp clips on Instagram or YouTube or Twitter is that people then just copy the tip. They just, so I'll give you an example. Mouratoglou at the moment is all over social media, giving little short lessons, short interventions with his players. Some people like it, some people don't, but it's certainly a charismatic clip to watch. And you do get a feeling of how he is as a coach, what he says, how he sees the game, how he sees strokes, tends to be very technical. But what's interesting to me is that then I'm concerned that coaches will watch that 30-second clip of Mouratoglou from Facebook, and then they will just copy the tip with their players because they've learned a new way of explaining something, or perhaps learned a new observation. And it could be both good and really bad, because like maybe your player doesn't need that tip. Maybe they don't need that tip right now. Maybe they don't need it to be explained that way because he's doing it with Serena Williams and you're working with 9-year-old Joe. So I'm worried that the instant gratification of drills and skills and watching short little episodes of people could be incredibly, misleading and not advantageous for the coach, because it doesn't provide the why. Why is he saying when you bend your knees, you reach up and throw your hand? Why is he saying that? Why now? What was happening to the ball? Working back from the context. And I just have a real concern about the use of social media for an educational tool without providing context and why, and discussing it in a more kind of healthy debate. What are your thoughts on that?
Please, Frank, you first.
Well, no, I think we talked about most of it. That it's when you talk about the why. So I use the word reflection. And in reflection, it's very important to think about the why. So why am I doing this? Is it effective? Is there another possibility? And so you have to be interested to be effective, and you need to learn the questions to reflect on your actions. And that is very critical. We do use a lot of evaluation and even judging, but as we know, reflection is much more powerful than just evaluation, or far more effective than judging. Because if you judge me and I'm depending on your judgment on me, that is not really effective. It doesn't affect my learning. It just affects my behavior because I want to get a better feedback next time. If you want to think about being effective, that's a different way that needs different feedback.
Simon, just to come back to what you asked Frank, is from my point of view, and that's something that is just coming into my mind when we are talking now, is obviously we cannot neglect information in social media or internet. It's something you cannot prevent people to go there. Sure. But one thing that is coming to my mind also that I would try to test in my following coach education courses or even workshops is to actually try to include it in a way that how we can help the coaches, beginner coaches, to evaluate what they see and how to put it in the context of the concepts that we are passing to them.
Yeah.
To actually teach them how to use it instead of telling, yeah, it's not perhaps good enough, or there are a lot of misleading things, but actually to say, okay, Mortoglu show you this, but how it fits to what we have discussed about technical development, about evaluating technique and improving modern teaching methodology or developing skills. So I believe that's something what we will have to, how to say, give a bit more time in our courses, is not just to pass the information, but also to teach them how to really use the unbelievable resource that nowadays is available. Because obviously when Frank was starting a while ago to be a coach, actually it was so difficult to find the information, to find the books. It was so difficult. I remember my time too, when I started, when you got some new book from the States or something, or when I will never forget, I was at that time coaching in Germany, when Jim Blair came out with this, his ideas about 16 seconds cure. It was like a new Bible for all of us. And we were so grateful to get such information, because it was not easy to get to the information. Nowadays, we have other problem. The young coaches have almost too much, and we should help them how to filter it and use it in that development. But at the end of the day, it's opportunity. I would not see it as a threat.
Sure.
So yeah, to add to that, again, in the competency, when I use the word to think, that is a different element. This cognitive element is to think about what you see, how you can reflect on it, is different than just giving knowledge and understanding. That's why I like, in the easy wording of the competency, the to think, to do, and to be and to want, as a great reference, because the thinking is what they need more than just reproducing knowledge that is written or is explained by the tutor.
So a couple of things on that. So Hrvoje, you talked, well, both Hrvoje and Frank, if I can summarize your point, that that information is fantastic, and all of us would agree on that. And it's knowing why and when to use it, context is important. But Frank, to think about thinking is probably one of the most critical skills as a coach in the modern world. To not just consume what's available to us and just project it onto our environment day to day, whatever is the latest trend, the latest book, the latest drill, the latest tip, but actually to sit on it for a while and think, why would I use that? What benefit would it be to my player? Is it the right way of explaining it? And the job of the coach educator is to ask those questions in a very intelligent way, to shift people's understanding, to codify things into a framework. As you said then, Hrvoje, why is Patrick Mouratoglou doing that? Is it a technical intervention? Is it doing it to increase ball speed? Is he doing it for more efficiency of the body? Is he doing it to prevent injury? Why is he doing it? And to ask those questions gives you a deeper level of learning. And actually will make you more informed on what to say and what not to say. Because I have a strong belief that in coaching sessions, and this is kind of a blanket, statement, that a lot of interventions we give as coaches probably are unnecessary. Maybe because they're wrong. Maybe we've seen the wrong thing and said the wrong thing, or maybe because the player's already doing it and we didn't need to say that. So I remember doing a course once, and it's a funny story. And the drill was, the coach wanted the player to bend their knees on the serve. Come on, bend your knees. Come on, you need to bend your knees. No, bend your knees more. Bend your knees more. Really, come on, sit down on the court. Sit down. And I looked, on every single repetition, the player was bending their knees, but the coach had a block in their mind, and they just was obsessed with giving the verbal tip of bending the knees. So I pulled the coach aside afterwards and said, how many times do you believe that they didn't bend their knees? Maybe 4 or 5 times. I said, look, I filmed it. I said, let's look back together. They bend their knees on every single one. So what is it exactly you want them to do by bending their knees? Is it the back knee, the front knee? Is it bend lower? Is it bend for longer? What exactly do you want to see? Because you're clearly not seeing something that you want the player to do, and what you're articulating is unnecessary because they actually are doing it. And it was a light bulb moment for the coach. It was one of those critical incidents that we had together. We were like, shit, yeah, I'm just talking for the sake of talking. I'm just saying these things to make ambient noise in the lesson, so I feel like I'm coaching. So it's things like that that I think are really important for coach educators and the coach education program to really identify and erase out of a coach's behaviors.
And probably it is a natural thing that when you're young, you want to show people how good you are, how much you know, so you talk a lot. Later on, as you stated 2 times now, and I think it's very important, is not about what to say, but also what to leave out, what to not tell the people. And this is what you find in music also. You know, when you're a young musician, you want to show everything that you can do. Later on, they all start playing a bit less. Yeah. And in jazz, you have guys, they say, I don't want to hit that many notes, but when I hit the note, I want you to hear it. That is, you know, an important thing. So there are a lot of situations where you could compare a similar principle. And that's really essential to select the things that the person needs instead of just throwing all this, well, let's say, BS over there.
Right, exactly. And I think that's my major point there on we talk about the future of coaching education. You know, it's not so obvious to me that it's easy to predict exactly how coach education will be engineered. I agree with Hrvoje. I think it will be more tailored, more bespoke. It'll be far more flexible. But at the same time, I still think there's a place for people going through a learning program that moves them in the room in the right way, that peer-to-peer learning occurs, but they also get exposure to international experts in their field, so they can reduce the natural errors that can occur in coaching by listening to experts to teach them their lessons as well. There's something important in that storytelling back. But the most important point I wanted to mention there was technology is going to drive a lot of how people are educated in tennis coaching, for sure. And I think virtual reality, augmented reality, you know, goggles, we can teach coaches to be a coach now, sat on their computer, as well as being on the court. Although I believe being on the court is far more greater, of greater value than that. But I think everything is possible because we don't really know exactly what the technology can do for us yet in learning. But the other thing is understanding the impact of your interventions. I think that will change a lot in the future. There'll be far more understanding around, look, we need to really measure what you're saying and how you're being as a coach, because that has a direct influence on how quickly you can get your players to learn. And so the direct correlation between what we say and what we do and the learning of the player, I think that will be codified and because it's hard to measure the effectiveness of a coach if you just use rankings and ratings as your only measure. Like, is that coach good? Well, that player's getting up the rating, that player's going up the rankings, that player's playing for GB now, that player's playing for Davis Cup, so they're doing a good job. And look, maybe that is the only way to measure, but I have a strong belief that there may be other ways to measure. And measuring the improvement of people day to day, week to week, is something that's not always done, not always scientifically done. And from a psychological point of view, understanding exactly what we say and when we say it and the impact it has on performance, I think that will be a really big part of the future of coaching per se. Well, first of all, I'll conclude the meeting now as well and saying thanks very much to Frank and to Hrvoje for, I think, a really fruitful discussion, because we touched on a lot of topics, and from both a high level, a broad level, and also a very narrow level. We went into a few topics in detail, and I really enjoyed the discussions with you. I certainly am thinking 100 miles an hour right now about what we can talk about in the future, how we can break things down, how we can make sense of things for people. But I've really enjoyed the discussion. So thank you for your time, and I'm really looking forward to our next chat.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.